I love Project Zomboid. It's been one of my favorite games for many years now, but it's no secret that it comes with its fair share of problems. The biggest, and the one I'll be focusing on today, being its progression. Not only was it struggling before, but Build 42 shows us signs that the Indie Stone has been prioritizing the wrong things. Before I begin, I'd like to mention that there's no universal critique of Project Zomboid. Project Zomboid is a primal survival game to some, it's a social sim to others, or even a mod-infested nightmare. But to most, it's an apocalypse. And that's what I'll be critiquing it on. I see common responses which attempt to nullify critiques such as, just play sandbox, or if you don't like a setting, just change it. And while I can see the sentiment, it's the wrong way of looking at and discussing game design. The Indie Stone have curated an intended experience, the one first presented to the player. Dismissing critique of this experience does not create a healthy environment to discuss game design. It has its problems, and they will be talked about. First off, Project Zomboid lacks incentives. Newer players will possess enough extrinsic motivation to meet their immediate needs when starting a new game, such as safety from zombies and supplies to sustain their health, which can be satiated in a surprisingly small amount of time. Further motivation must be found from inside the player. This intrinsic motivation likely manifests as choosing to explore and loot beyond what's needed to get by. But over time, players have found this to become quite repetitive, as the types and act of loot and looting becomes increasingly predictable and stale. Now, Build 42 has attempted to remedy this by cutting down on the amount of loot spawning in containers and adding extra flavor in the form of pamphlets and books. While these force the player to venture out more for sustainable loot and add extra flavor to the game respectively, these changes and additions to looting only spread out the gameplay loop of the act artificially, only prolonging the same realization as before, that there really isn't much out there to see. Oh, this is a cool bunker. Now what? Oh, this is a cool boat. Now what? I don't mean to sound cynical, but besides sightseeing, there is little meaningful incentive for the player to explore past what they need to explore this vast map. It's great flavor, but it adds absolutely zero substance. But Pumpkin, if you're looking for substance, then look no further than the overhauled crafting and building systems. They're not good. Looking at these systems from an action priority matrix, engaging with them fully sits somewhere around here. The amount of effort the player must put in to reap any sort of actual reward is just too high to be worth it. Okay, alright, yeah, you need an example, okay. Take this makeshift meat cleaver for instance. To build this, you need at least 3 levels in welding, light, a surface, a welder mask, a file, a wrench, a hand drill, sheet metal strips, an iron rod, a welding torch with at least 2 units of fuel, some steel sheet metal, a rag, and nuts and bolts. All to create a meat cleaver. You know, the thing you find in 50% of your starter houses? What is the point of welding my own melee weapons if not only is the effort involved astronomically high for the reward of an item you could have just looted, but now that combat is heavily decentralized with the new muscle strain and fatigue mechanics of Build 42? Realism? I hear this word thrown around a lot as a way to rationalize the mechanics and systems which actively seek to dampen the accessibility of a game like Project Zomboid. I get it, the top 1% of players broke your game wide open and trivialized its biggest threats, so you punished them. But in doing so, you punished everyone else. Trickle-down balance doesn't work in a game like Project Zomboid. Veteran players will always learn to adapt and break the game in other ways, while newer players will just find themselves further and further behind. Artificially thinning out the gameplay loop and bloating the game with potentially interesting but ultimately tedious mechanics and systems doesn't remedy Project Zomboid's sense of stale progression. So what will? I imagine a number of you saw this coming, but it's NPCs. NPCs are truly the only way a lot of people, myself included, see the Indie Stone adding more genuine depth to the game. All the way back in 2013 AD, NPCs were actually removed from the game. Yeah, there was a brief period back when Project Zomboid looked like a Game Boy game that had fully functioning NPCs. I should say more disabled, as the code for them has remained ever since, and that's what mods such as Day 1 Bandits were born from. The Indie Stone have plans to reintroduce NPCs in Build 43 and fully implementing them by Build 42. I don't know about you, but if Build 43's NPC reintegration update is a glorified reactivation switch flip, I'm going to be very disappointed, but also not very surprised. I don't want to say the work between Build 41 and 42 has been futile in actually improving the game's depth, as obviously a lot of effort has gone into making many aspects of it. Of course, I'm in agreement that all the new towns and pretty things to look at are quaint additions, but without any added depth or incentives to visit these places besides what else is there to do, or the quite frankly bloated and unintuitive crafting and building system overhauls, I just get the feeling that there's been some efforts channeled into the wrong things for a few years now, if the genuine intention was to make Project Zomboid a deeper game and not just a bigger one. But hey, I don't work for the Indie Stone, and I'd like to think they have a better idea of what the players want than I do. So I can only hope that in the coming builds, everything will fall into place. If I live that long. So let's imagine, NPCs are added to the game. In what ways could they add more depth to the world and gameplay loop of an average Project Zomboid run? Well, for me, NPCs would have to function in a way that incentivizes players to explore the map and engage with the building system, despite the current state it's in. How this could all be done is extremely open-ended, so I'll let you lot spitball ideas in the comments for how they could function. But for now, I'll throw my own hat in the ring with some ideas. Some things I feel pretty confident about that the Indie Stone will integrate into the new NPC system is that their spawn rates and types would be determined on location. This could give more incentive to spawn as and at neglected occupations in towns respectively, depending on your intentions. Back in 2013, NPCs had different personalities, which would determine how they interacted with the player. Some would be hostile, some would be neutral, and others would just rather be left alone. So I imagine these mechanics would be brought over into the new system as well. Right now, placing barricades in your safe house to ward off hordes of zombies that will never come is cute, but giving that act all players go through the motions of meaning would be great, and this could be done with hostile NPCs. There's a lot of things that could completely shake up the way in which we approach the world of Project Zomboid, if that is their intention. And it starts with adding more engaging situations and incentives, not tedious, unrewarding systems and pamphlets. But this isn't the end. There's something I want to go back to. A word. Realism. For a game which seems to pride itself in striving for unwavering realism, Project Zomboid is pretty unrealistic. Drinking river water is immediately as dangerous as drinking bleach. Several mundane tasks can only be performed while standing completely still. The stones of a campfire seemingly disintegrate in the case of a spreading fire, and countless other ridiculous things, which makes taking this badge of honor seriously quite difficult. What about the genuinely realistic things? Well, the biggest point of contention, and something I've neglected to fully talk about until now, is muscle strain. Yeah, I just heard a few of your hearts break. The latest band-aid mechanic made to artificially slow down the marching order towards boredom. Muscle strain is a debuff to your character which activates after the game deems you've made too much progress today. Seriously though, this mechanic has been explained countless times by people who care more about the numbers than I do. I care more about the implications of integrating such a mechanic in the first place. Yes, Build 42 is in Unstable, but they had a long time to tweak this mechanic before releasing it en masse to the public at all. So to me, that shows enough intention where criticism of this mechanic is fair game. So what do I actually think of this mechanic? I don't actually hate it. Its purpose makes sense if their balancing objective of Build 42 was to slow down the player early game and make them assess a situation more before brute forcing their way through it. But do I think a change like this was needed at all? It's hard to say for sure, but I'd say no. Again, the veterans will adapt. What this mechanic will do in the long run is hard to say for certain, but it's likely just going to alienate newer players even further than they already were. It all comes back around to this weird obsession with stretching out the current gameplay loop instead of meaningfully adding to it. Oh, and of course, realism, whatever that means at this point. I imagine such a game-changing mechanic will be tuned down for the full release, as altering the way players approach any given confrontation in one fell swoop and expecting it not to ruffle any feathers isn't something I imagine even they thought would fly. There's a chance that the Indie Stone purposely overtuned this mechanic for the Unstable build, just to get some genuine public opinion on its existence entirely, but that may just be wishful thinking. I realize I've been extremely critical during this video, and I just want to remind you, the viewer, that this frustration comes from a place of love. Speaking of love, there is an extrinsic motivator that's often overlooked in how impactful it could be on the gameplay loop, and that's the helicopter event, or more so the implications of a mechanic like it. A mechanic, in this case an event, that gives the player actual outward pressures to continue looting and improving beyond what is immediately needed is an easy way to ward off the gameplay loop becoming stale. Now, I'm not saying that Project Zomboid needs to go full 7 days to die mode, where there's a giant onslaught of zombies hounding the player once per week, but the implications of a mechanic like it is absolutely a step in the right direction. For example, the most raw, unfiltered fun I have had in Project Zomboid in recent memory was a couple months ago on a multiplayer server with friends, where we liberated and were slowly building up defenses and vehicle routes at and around the golf course just outside Riverside. This was going great, but we forgot we had the Horde Night mod on, and with no time to prepare, hell just descended on our safe haven. Someone caught wind of what was happening, and everyone jumped on the server to rally together and fight to protect what was ours. and it was brilliant. It's moments like that that highlighted not only the greatness of multiplayer, but also what a wrangled group of NPC misfits could add to those single player experiences. But just as a reminder, there is no universal critique of Project Zomboid as a single game, as it is many, but the one it is to most, and Apocalypse, has its problems, and I want nothing more than the root of these problems to be remedied. Thank you guys for watching. I'd love to hear some of your opinions, some of your takes. I understand that this video isn't going to sit well with everyone, and that's fine. Just make sure you're thinking straight before you go down and leave some angry comment. But I'm happy to have a civilized back and forth. If you're a little upset by anything, just go get yourself a cup of tea, have a little calm down, and then leave a comment. Alright.